Hello, everyone. This is Introduction to Soil Science at Pierce College, and we're working on Chapter 12, Plant Nutrition. And this is from the Plaster Soil Science and Management text. So let's go ahead and take a look. All right, so after this chapter, you should be able to discuss nitrogen nutrition, the nitrogen cycle, phosphorus nutrition, potassium nutrition. You should also be able to answer questions about the secondary nutrients and the trace elements. So I'd like to go over my notes just for a moment before we move on to go through the slides. So let's go ahead and take a look at those. Okay, so we just finished chapter 11 and we were talking about the problems with sodic and saline soils, and a salt buildup problem, especially involving sodium in the sodic soils, can be helped by the application of lime, which is agricultural lime, also known as calcium carbonate, or of gypsum. And remember that gypsum does not change the pH. So it has that advantage. Okay, so first of all, when we talk about the macronutrients, then we're talking about, first of all, the primary macronutrients. Macronutrients are needed in large amounts by plants. The primary macronutrients include nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Now, nitrogen functions to make plants green. Sometimes we'll call nitrogen the stay green nutrient. It makes the plants green, hardy, and lush. It is effective for promoting vegetative growth. And if we have a deficiency, then it will show a lack of green in the tissues. In other words, the tissue is going to look chlorotic. So for phosphorus, it's important because of its function in promoting root growth when plants are being established. It also is involved in reproductive growth. Deficiency is going to reflect purpling of leaves and stunting. The purple pigment that we see is called anthocyanin. For root growth, that's going to be at the beginning of the plant's life. And then for reproductive growth, of course, we're talking about during flower and seed production. And with that, phosphorus is also important for energy in the plant because it is part of ATP, or adenosine triphosphate. Adenosine triphosphate is what organisms use for energy. And P then, or phosphorus, is the P in ATP. For potassium, it functions to reinforce strength in the plant stems. So when we talk about hardiness, the stems themselves will actually be more durable if we have adequate potassium. It's also involved in hardening. So this can be hardening for heat or cold, as well as having some involvement in disease resistance and water relations. If we have a lack of potassium, it can also affect the uptake of other nutrients since it's involved in water relations. A deficiency of potassium will exhibit lodging and marginal scorch, which is a burning around the edge of the leaves. Now, the secondary macronutrients are also used in large amounts by the plant, and they're of secondary importance to the primary ones. So those include calcium, magnesium, sulfur, and iron. Now, calcium is involved in cell wall reinforcement, and for that reason, it's also involved in pest and pathogen resistance because a strong cell wall is going to be difficult for infections or pests to penetrate. Okay, if we have a deficiency of calcium, you may see distorted leaves, You'll see black scorching of leaf tips, and there will also be blackened fruits or produce. For magnesium, magnesium is an enzyme cofactor. That's one of its functions. It's also the center of the chlorophyll molecule. If we have a magnesium deficiency, it may manifest as interveinal chlorosis, or a yellowing in between the veins of the leaves, or a marbling of older leaves. Now, sulfur, also a secondary macronutrient, is important for building proteins, and methionine is a sulfur-containing protein. Every protein begins with methionine because methionine is part of the start codon that starts translation from RNA to protein. Methionine and cysteine are both amino acids containing sulfur. The cysteine is an amino acid that has a disulfide bond, and it's like a really strong bond. So it's involved in, strengthening and supporting the plant tissue. Deficiency symptoms of sulfur may include white on the inside of the plant foliage. So from the center out, you may see white. Iron has a function in metabolism, respiration, and chlorophyll production. If we have a deficiency in iron, the symptoms that will be exhibited could be chlorosis and the new growth. They can be caused by high pH because iron is not available at high pH. There may also be enhanced heavy metal intake other than iron itself, interveinal chlorosis, similar to what we saw with magnesium, and leaf chlorosis or yellowing. So the difference here being that the chlorosis is in the new growth as opposed to with nitrogen. And for the micronutrients are also called the trace elements. The trace elements are needed in small amounts or trace amounts within the plant. One of those is boron. Boron has a similar role to calcium, so it is involved with reinforcing the cell wall. Boron deficiency will also be similar looking to what we see with our calcium deficiency. For zinc, it's an enzyme cofactor involved in auxin formation. Auxin is important for elongation, as well as elongation of the plant cells, as well as in plant rooting. Manganese is important for plant metabolism. Copper is an enzyme cofactor as well, and it's also associated with disease resistance in plants. Chlorine is related to water relations and movement of water within the plant, as well as disease resistance. It's needed in a small amount by the plant. Molybdenum, with molybdenum, there are enzymes that are associated with molybdenum that reduce nitrate to ammonia, so going from the NO3 minus to the NH4 plus on the way into being made into a protein. So molybdenum is involved in the reduction of nitrate to ammonia in protein production. Cobalt is specifically involved in nitrogen fixation, so especially important for our legumes. And nickel helps plants to metabolize urea nitrogen, which is a common commercial nitrogen that growers use. And it has the urease cofactor. Nickel itself is the cofactor for the urease enzyme that's going to actually lyse the urea itself. All right, other beneficial elements. Sodium is possibly useful in small amounts, but it can also be toxic. Okay, and of course, we've talked a lot about how sodic soils are not suitable for most crops. And silicate plays a similar role to calcium in strengthening the cell wall and may lead to a possible increase in biomass. All right, so let's take another look here at the slides. Okay, getting a little bit more in depth into nitrogen. We have adequate supply of nitrogen. In that case, we should expect fast growth. We're going to expect a robust root system, strong photosynthesis, good water use of carbohydrates and their conversion to proteins is increased with adequate nitrogen supply. Crops will be more productive and will have thicker, greener, lesser turf. Can we scratch a little bit? So it's worth, okay. First, let's take a look at the figure. So here we can see an example of a nitrogen deficiency. And the plants that are in the foreground, those are potatoes that are in a sandy soil that's deficient in nitrogen. So the plants in the background have adequate nitrogen. The plants in the foreground do not. And the ones that are in the foreground are pale green and they have a chlorotic appearance. Okay, so they look a little bit yellow in this case. Okay, but it's also worth noting that while nitrogen speeds growth, and plants that have adequate nitrogen will be vigorous, they'll have large leaves and long stem internodes, that too much nitrogen can cause toxicity. So you can have an excess of nitrogen. So one thing is easily injured growth. You may have succulent growth. High nitrogen growth is more prone to insects and diseases. It tends to attract pests. Overly rapid growth also slows maturity and ripening of crops. So remember that nitrogen is especially for vegetative growth, but that it may delay ripening, may delay flowering, and overly rapid growth also delays hardening off process. So that makes sense if we talk about having fragile stems and things of that nature. Also, this hardening off process is part of the acclimatization to like a winter environment, for example. So hardening is important when transitioning into cold, like if it's winter or if we have really intense light. And so in that sense, they can be damaged. Oh yeah, too much nitrogen also can make the crop not taste good, right? Because it interferes with the ripening. Okay, so out of all the essential elements, nitrogen is going to be the one that moves and changes the most. So in the nitrogen cycle, we have gains, losses, and changes. And the central portion of this is going to be carried out by microorganisms. So let's take a look at this. Okay, so here we have the central portion here. We can start with here our diatomic nitrogen, which is the N2. The N2 is going to be fixed by microorganisms. Okay, so we can have biological fixation that occurs, for example, with our rhizobium bacteria that perform this function of nitrogen fixation, and they form a beneficial relationship with the legume plant roots. So things like peas and beans are going to form this association with the nitrogen fixers. We also have some free living nitrogen fixers like the Frankia species that don't require the association with plants in order to have this function. So biological fixation is where the nitrogen is taken from the atmosphere and then it's fixed into organic nitrogen. So that could be nitrogen that's bound up in an organism or in the soil. It might be part of the human substances that are exuded. As these things are breaking down, they become mineralized, Okay, that's a process of mineralization here. And they are in transformed into ammonia. So here we have our ammonium ion. That's the preferred choice for plants, the preferred form of nitrogen for plants. And in that case, the nitrogen in the form of ammonium may be immobilized back into organic nitrogen because the plants uptake it and it becomes then part of the body of the plant. If the process continues, however, then nitrogen, the NH4 plus ammonium nitrogen is oxidized to nitrate, or the NO3 minus here. And here, when nitrogen is added to the soil, that's nitrification. NO3 minus, or the nitrate, is it doesn't have a really strong affinity for the soil and it tends to leach readily. So that's one of the problems with nitrate, is that it's going to be easily lost, more easily than the ammonia nitrogen. From there, we can also have denitrification. That's when nitrogen leaves the soil, in this case, by the process of reduction. And this is performed by microbes, where they're going to, instead of oxidizing, they're going to reduce the nitrate back to ammonia nitrogen. And that is going to be further reduced to diatomic atmospheric nitrogen, which is the N2. Now, ammonia, as opposed to readily leaching, also has the property of being easily volatilized. So it is possible that some nitrogen in the form of ammonia will leave the soil by volatilization, and it will be lost that way. Okay, we also can have the industrial fixation, which is how fertilizer is made. And you can read about that process of how the diatomic nitrogen is then made and fixed into fertilizer. So when the biological fixation occurs, if we can come back to this part of the cycle here, the nitrate, of course, also can be taken up by plants or other organisms like microorganisms who will immobilize that nitrogen into organic nitrogen. Okay, just like we saw with the ammonium. That's like when uptake occurs and then it becomes actually part of the organism themselves, right? Like it's nutrition, so the plants eat and then they grow. So that involves the immobilization of nitrogen. Okay, so the growing of crops, farming itself, can increase nitrogen loss from the soil. You can think about harvesting, right? We're taking the nitrogen directly out of the soil when we harvest the crops. If you have like potatoes, we've been talking about potatoes. When potatoes are harvested, nitrogen can also be lost from the soil that way because it's a root crop. And of course, they try not to take too much soil out of the field, but some nitrogen can be lost. You can also have freely moving excess, like your runoff that's not taken up by plants, and that can be lost from the soil. Growing crops because of erosion, like through the harvest or other practices, as soil is carried off in the runoff even, increases nitrogen loss. The leaching, especially of nitrogen in the form of nitrate, increases nitrogen loss. And liming also can increase the nitrogen loss from the soil. Okay, so here we have another example here showing the nitrogen cycle. And here we can also take into account the like the manuring that comes from animals, right? As we're thinking about that, the manure is going to decompose into organic matter. The organic nitrogen can be broken down to ammonium and into nitrate. Of course, this is also accompanied by the symbiotic fixation of nitrogen by the legumes, as they have that beneficial association with the rhizobium bacteria. The feeding from animals is also going to contribute to the gain, because the animals are going to contribute to the manure. And additions of fertilizer, for example, fertilizers that are produced by the artificial fixation of diatomic nitrogen from the atmosphere, those are going to be gained because fertilizer is being applied to the soil. However, there are also losses here on the left-hand side, right? So when denitrification occurs and the organisms are removing, the microorganisms are reducing the nitrate in the soil back to diatomic nitrogen, that is a loss. When ammonia is volatilized and goes into the atmosphere, that is a loss. If there's erosion because of, for example, too much irrigation or wind erosion, erosion caused by equipment, then that will result in a loss from the soil. And also, of course, the nitrogen that's uptaken by the plants and then is removed by the crop when the cropping or the actual harvest occurs. That is also a loss. So for this reaction, I guess we sort of have like an equilibrium. There's two different processes, the process mineralization and immobilization. Immobilization is going to be when these mineral nitrate forms or mineral nitrogen forms like nitrate, ammonium are immobilized and taken up by the plant, and then they become organic nitrogen. That's like basically the nitrogen is becoming part of the plant itself or part of the organisms or part of the organic matter. And then in mineralization, that's where the organic matter or the organic nitrogen is then broken down into the mineral components, the mineral nitrogen, including the ammonium, the nitrate. And this is going to be mineralized typically at a rate of 90 pounds per acre per year. And usually 3% of the nitrogen is in a mineralized form if we're out in the field. The organic nitrogen is going to compose most of it, and that's about 97%. So different forms of nitrogen in the soil, they include organic matter, ammonium nitrogen, and the nitrate nitrogen. So for organic nitrogen, it's usually stored in the humus of the soil. That's like that exudate that the microorganisms put out, the sticky stuff. We have losses through mineralization and erosion of the organic nitrogen. The plant can't directly use organic nitrogen because it's immobilized. And the changes that occur are the mineralization where it becomes available. Ammonium nitrogen is stored when it's adsorbed to the soil surface or it sticks to the soil column. Losses can involve volatilization, going back into the air, or erosion. The plants can use ammonium nitrogen, and then the changes involve immobilization if it's taken up by plants, for example, or nitrification if ammonium nitrogen is then reduced to diatomic nitrogen by microorganisms. Now, in terms of nitrate nitrogen, it's not really stored in the soil too much because we have that problem of leaching. Nitrate nitrogen has a low affinity for the soil. Losses can occur by leaching or by denitrification, as the nitrate can be converted either to ammonia or all the way back to diatomic nitrogen by the microorganisms. Nitrate nitrogen is usable by plants and it undergoes the changes of immobilization or denitrification. Okay, nitrogen deficiency. You may see slow growth or stunting. Like we saw on the slide previous, we had chlorosis, which is a lack of the dark green color that we're looking for. You may also have, in severe case, of firing or drying up of the leaves, where the leaves just look like they've been completely burned. Phosphorus, the responses that we're going to see to adequate supply, these are normal reproduction and cell division, normal energy transfer. We'll see good cell membrane integrity and function. That phosphorus is part of the phosphid or phospholipid bilayer that we have in the cell membrane. Phosphorus promotes early and rapid root growth, efficient water use, and better resistance to cold and disease. Okay, so here, phosphorus comes from weathering of soil minerals such as apatite. The most phosphorus is stored in organic matter or fixed forms. At any one time, only a tiny amount of phosphate is in the solution and actually available to plants. So most of it is actually going to be stored. So if we have phosphorus deficiency, we're going to see stunted growth. We'll have an example on the next page. Different forms of phosphorus that we will see in the soil include calcium phosphate, orthophosphate, as well as clay particles. So here we have greenhouse geraniums that show classic phosphorus deficiency symptoms here. The deficient plant is on the right. It's stunted and it is dark green, but it has a purpling of older leaves. And the symptoms may result from low soil phosphorus or cold soil inhibiting phosphorus uptake. So if you have cold temperatures, this also can lead to a phosphorus deficiency. So movement and uptake in the soil, it moves very slowly in mineral soil. So the phosphorus is not going to leach readily in the same way that we see for nitrate. We don't see that for phosphate. Phosphorus uptake is affected by the pH, right? The pH can affect the availability, the amount of soil moisture. If you don't have soil moisture, uptake's not going to occur. Oxygen, soil warmth. Remember, cold temperatures inhibit phosphorus uptake. Any condition that limits root growth will limit phosphorus uptake. And also, mycorrhizal infection enhances phosphorus uptake. So mycorrhizae, the mycorrhizae are fungi, and they form a beneficial association with plant roots, and that can help with phosphorus uptake. So the mycorrhizae are mostly the mushrooms or the Basidiomycota, and there are different types, and some of them are going to be host specific. All right, so with phosphorus, if we have a deficiency, we're going to see stunting, fewer, smaller leaves, a purple tint to leaves and stems, especially on the lower, older leaves, and then delayed maturity. Phosphorus is important for reproduction and cell division, don't forget. All right, next with potassium. This is related to water movement, so it has many functions that are related to osmosis. The potassium is important for the opening and closing of the stomata because the stomata inflate and deflate based on being filled up with water. Common minerals and clays have potassium. The potassium has a positive charge. It's part of feldspar and mica, and these things can easily be taken up by plant roots. It does leach more readily than phosphorus. If we think about like potassium salts, they are very soluble. However, they're not going to leach as readily as nitrogen does. So here we have an example where potassium is being trapped in the soil or fixed in the soil. So here we have potassium fixation occurring. There are potassium ions that are trapped between two layers of illite and vermiculite. However, if we use montmorillonite, the layers open up so that potassium does not get trapped. Okay, next, potassium comes from the weathering of minerals like feldspar. So we were just talking about that. Soil stores potassium by adsorbing it. So it's going to be then stuck on the soil colloids and fixing some of it in certain clay particles. So that would be similar to what we just saw with the vermiculite, and the vermiculite is expanded mica. Okay, so if we have a potassium deficiency, that's going to result in slow uptake of other nutrients because it's involved in the water relations. We'll see a marginal scorch, which is a burning around the edge of the leaves, lodging, or the plant's literally falling over because the stems are too weak. Okay, and here's an example of a cotton plant that has a potassium deficiency, and we can see yellowing or browning of the leaf margins, which we call the marginal scorch. Okay, so let's now turn our attention to the secondary nutrients, the secondary macronutrients. They're still needed in a large amount. So if we have adequate calcium, we're going to have strong cell walls and membranes. We'll have stress protective proteins that are formed with calcium, and we'll also have better carbohydrate movement. However, if calcium is deficient, then we're going to have storage problems. Blossom end rot occurs in tomato and pepper with calcium deficiency. We also have bitter pit and water core in apples, which is a problem caused by calcium deficiency. Poinsettias will have bract burn. We'll have a black heart of celery, and leaf burn occurs in lily from calcium deficiency. Now, calcium pectate is a substance that gives strength to the cells and it glues them together. So we can see it in this example of the like beigeish cell here, has the calcium pectate layer. Calcium is important for the cell wall and membrane integrity, as well as holding those adjacent cells together. In this slide, we can see potato, right? So on the left here, potato grows normally, and they're doing a hydroponic nutrient study. The one on the left is supplied with calcium. The one on the right, here we can see that with calcium minus, so calcium is not supplied, shoot tips die in the calcium deficient plant, where cells are actively dividing. The new cells lack strong cell walls and membranes. If the roots were examined, I should say, their tips also would be dead. So the root and shoot tips require the calcium for that proper development. Okay, great. And here we can look at some of the natural sources of calcium. We have limestone, dolomite, and gypsum. And weathering releases calcium and magnesium from the soil, and those minerals like dolomite, and stores them on soil colloid. So that's where the adsorption occurs. Another important secondary macronutrient is magnesium. And if there's adequate supply of magnesium, the plants will be green, right? And the magnesium is the essential ingredient in chlorophyll. Plants will have increased uptake of other nutrients, and because magnesium is an enzyme cofactor, it'll also be enzyme activation. If magnesium is deficient, there'll be less resistance to drought, cold, and disease. You'll see intraveinal chlorosis, which is that yellowing in between the leaf veins, and leaf mottling, or that spotting, like that mosaic look where it's like yellowish, greenish, yellowish, greenish. And then you can see here that this is a model of a chlorophyll molecule. And you can see that magnesium is here right in the center. Okay, here we can see an example of a magnesium deficiency. The top corn leaf has the intraveinal chlorosis, which is a result of the magnesium deficiency. And then the bottom one has sufficient magnesium and it looks normal. What about sulfur? If we have adequate supply of sulfur, then the plants are going to be green, right? Because sulfur is required to make chlorophyll. Sulfur is also important in the nodulation of legumes. So when the legumes form that beneficial association with the rhizobium bacteria, the rhizobia are the ones that fix the nitrogen from the atmosphere and bring it into the soil. The nodules are like where the bacteria live inside of the plant root. So you'll have like a kind of like a pearl type of a lump or a structure. And that's the root nodule and the root of the legumes, like our pea plants, our beans, those other Fabaceae that are nitrogen fixers. So sulfur is important in protein production. So it's important for nodulation of legumes as well. It aids in seed production. Bright mini seeds are rich in protein. We have improved stress tolerance, plant appearance, and animal nutrition when there's enough sulfur. And sulfur is also important for the flavor of many fruits and vegetables. If we have sulfur deficiency, again, we're going to see stunting and pale leaf color, especially toward the center of the leaf. Now, I've described iron as a secondary micro or macronutrient. Here, they're giving it as a micronutrient, but it's needed in a larger amount by plants. We have, for the micronutrients, manganese, zinc, copper, and nickel. And these trace elements interact with enzymes that control biological reactions. Iron also included does form a chelate. Okay. And when we have chelation of a metal ion, we can have complex organic molecules that surround the ion and they form several bonds with it. And that is going to form a protective layer around the ion. So the reason why this is important is remember that our iron, manganese, zinc, copper, those are not available at a high pH, but we can apply these foliarly by using a chelated form and then spraying that on the leaves instead. With the organic or with the metallic trace elements and with iron, if we have too much, it can cause toxicity. Okay, and then here we have an example of a manganese deficiency. The symptom of manganese deficiency is intraveinal chlorosis as well. Now, we also have some anionic trace elements, one of which is boron. So this one has a negatively charged ion. It's still an active area of research. It's not well understood in terms of its functions, although it's similar to calcium. If we have a deficiency of boron, we'll have weakened cell walls, terminal bud death. So that's like those shoot tips. We'll have bushy growth, blackened hearts, and pollination may be decreased. Okay, if we have too much boron, in that case, it causes toxicity. So here, this is an example of a black heart of cauliflower and it resulted from boron deficiency. And here we also have yellowing and cupping of leaf margins. This is a symptom of boron toxicity in cauliflower. And then let's take a look at these other anionic trace elements that, in that case, these are negatively charged ions when they're dissolved in the soil solution. So we have molybdenum. Molybdenum is needed for nitrogen metabolism as well as nitrogen fixation. And too much molybdenum can harm crops in the mustard family. Those are the brassicas, because those crops are sensitive to it. Chlorine is not well understood either. It does have a role in water relations. It also plays a role in photosynthesis, and it can occur in toxic levels as well. So this is really just a trace element. Large amounts of chlorine are not beneficial. Some beneficial elements include cobalt, silicon, and sodium. These are not essential. They're not essential for plant growth and reproduction. All right, so we've gone over quite a few things today. We have talked about the mineral nutrients as well as beneficial elements. Keep in mind that nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium are most critical for strong, healthy plants. The solubility and mobility of these elements is important. Remember, solubility is going to determine the plant uptake. It's important based on the soil pH. The mobility is important in terms of changes and losses in the soil. When the nutrients are well balanced, plants will grow the best. And we also can have a number of plant health problems that are caused by shortages or deficiencies and excesses, which can lead to toxicity to the plant. All right, everyone, thank you for joining me today for Plant Nutrition.